is update on landlord and tenant resources. Human Services Manager Colleen Brandt Schuler will be speaking, and then also Rental Housing Inspection Program Coordinator Lori Fleming and Hida McLendon with King County will be the speakers. I'm sorry if I didn't pronounce somebody's name appropriately, but we're going to go. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Sorry, I was just elevated. Is the floor mine? I'll take that as a yes. Thank you. Good evening, Mayor and Council and community. Thanks so much for having us. At the November 1st Council meeting, it was requested that we discuss resources and updates related to landlords and tenants. We're here to provide a presentation on city and county efforts that address the sunsetting of the Governor's Bridge moratorium, as well as efforts to address the needs that will occur when Burion's moratorium ends in January. You asked about resources for assistance with rent and should evictions occur. In addition, you asked for a brief update on the rental housing inspection program. We attached several resources with your agenda, Bill, that should folks ask you personally for where to turn, you have those resources in your hand. Those resources and other human services information can be accessed on the City of Burien website as well. Myself, as well as other staff here at City Hall, connect residents to these resources on a regular basis. The city remains deeply concerned for our residents and landlords struggling with rent and utilities, among many needs, and continues to provide grants to agencies that can assist. To assist Burien residents with basic needs, even prior to COVID, City Human Services General Fund dollars have been granted to agencies providing rent, utility, and food assistance. With COVID, the city invested those general funds and both CARES and CDBG CV1 funds to address the growing needs. I'll call your attention to the agenda, Bill, where we listed out a breakdown of fund sources, agencies providing the assistance and funds that they've received, and the number of households served. It's important to note that some agencies pay the last $500 owed, and others are leveraging both EPRAP and our funding to pay large sums of back rent and some rent forward. To summarize, starting in 2020 to the third quarter of 2021, we have invested a little over $500,000 in rent and utility support and served roughly 532 households, many of which are families. On a much larger scale, both financially and geographically, King County has also rolled out a rent assistance program called the Eviction Prevention and Rent Assistance Program, or otherwise known as EPRAP, to help people experiencing financial hardship due to COVID-19 who are at risk of housing instability or homelessness. So please welcome Hida McLendon, the COVID Emergency Services Group Director at King County's Department of Community and Human Services, to give you an overview of EPRAP. Thanks for being here, Hida.
Thanks, Colleen. Thank you for having me. Good evening, Mayor Mata and the Burien City Council. Appreciate the opportunity to present on the EPRAP program. Next slide, please. Some key takeaways about the Eviction Prevention Rental Assistance Program. Things have accelerated. Currently, we are getting just around between $8 and $10 million a week out in rent payments to residents of King County that are in rent arrears. So we have accelerated. There is still more to do. We have a lot of community members, including community members in Burien, that are in the process of getting their rent paid, but we have not gotten there yet. The other key takeaway is rent assistance is really a short-term necessity, but not a long-term solution. Ultimately, as you all are very well aware, across King County in many jurisdictions, we have an affordable housing crisis, and people were not able to pay their rent and afford living in this community before the pandemic. And the pandemic has really exacerbated that. So here at King County, while yes, we are putting out a lot of rental assistance money, we are also really doing a lot of work to increase the amount of just affordable housing that is available people in the community. And then the other thing we are seeing is there's a very high likelihood that we are not going to have enough funding here to meet all the demand that we are seeing currently in King County. Next slide, please. As Colleen mentioned, there are two aspects of this program. One is the eviction prevention aspect, and the other is the rental assistance aspect. I'm going to focus tonight on talking about the rental assistance aspect. At the end, loop back to the eviction prevention aspect. Next slide, please. So to ground everybody, the eviction prevention rental assistance program began in 2020. We worked with a number of community-based organizations and successfully got around $37 million of rent payments out. In the beginning of 2021, from January to June, just under $12 million went out to the community. Currently, we are working on the column that is in yellow. It's $123 million. King County receives funding directly from the Department of Treasury and then indirectly through the Department of Commerce. Between July and October, currently we've spent about 70 million, and now I think it's around 85 million of that 123 million. And our total to date in mid-November is just under $100 million that have been spent since January. So we anticipate spending out all of the orange column, which we call EPRAP 2.0 funding, but before the end of this year, and then beginning to spend EPRAP 3.0 funding next year. That right now is anticipated to be an additional $177 million worth of funding. As a reminder, for the eligibility for King County is households that are in rent arrears, households that are 50% area median income and below. And the way our program is designed is we pay the amount of rent that is in arrears, and then we pay 3 months of forward rent to everybody, with really a goal of not only helping people to avoid eviction, but also to really stabilize households, give them a little bit of a foundation in which to build from, to really get ahead on their payments. Next slide, please. To give you a sense, this is the same data. The blue is what was previously in the yellow column. This shows you our week over week spending. Currently, we're tracking around $8 to $10 million per week, as I mentioned. Early on, one of our strategies that was allowable by Treasury is to give landlords advances. So about 320 landlords from across King County back in the spring applied early to be part of EPRAP. As part of that, they agreed not to evict their tenants and not to raise the rent. And they were able to show how many tenants they had in arrears, what the total cost was, and we provided them upfront 50% of those arrears with a guarantee they would have to come back and give us the paperwork after the fact. Some of our early numbers were driven by those advances. That program has since closed. We have given all the landlords that requested advances, and now we're doing the work to actually get all the paperwork and see if there are more tenants we need to serve. Next slide, please. If you don't mind, keep going. There's some data here that you're welcome to look at, but I won't cover this evening, around our 2020 program and some of the great lessons learned we had. I'm going to pass over those for the sake of time. If you don't mind, one more, advance one more for me. Great, thank you so much. So there are three paths that community members can access EPRAP. The property owner or manager could sign up. This is the group I was just speaking about that has been getting advances. There's 320 property owners from across King County that agreed to sign up early. That has closed. We have a sort of set group we are working on. There's the tenant pool or the tenant portal. This is still open. The way to access this is renthelp@kingcounty.gov. You can pre-register any community member that is behind in arrears and thinks they meet the eligibility and are 50% AMI can sign up, be part of the tenant pool, and then each week we are doing a randomized poll of tenants, and based on our community's capacity, having people get services. We're pulling down around 400 or 500 tenants a week these days, and we're having about 200 new community members apply to be part of the tenant pool. The third way that EPRAP is serving the community is we have a bunch of nonprofits, by and for nonprofits, many of which are in South King County, that are serving specific populations, whether it's the Native American community, whether it is the city of SeaTac or some of the other communities. They are actually have their doors open. They're doing events in their community. They are really serving their community members that really have been identified to having barriers to accessing and being able to self-serve, for example, access to Wi-Fi or computers or literacy. There is a ton of work happening to assure that these services are provided in many language. Many of our documents are translated. We have outreach providers that speak something to the tune of 23 different languages that are available on the through our phone number. That number is 206-477-1331, and you'll have options for staff members that speak Spanish, that speak Dari, and a variety of languages that are spoken in the specific islands. Next slide, please. One more slide, please. Some of what Treasury recently has allowed us to do is a practice called attestation. In EPRAP, the way it works at a very high level is we'd like to talk about it as sealing the deal. There are things we have to gather from the tenants, and there are documents we have to gather from the landlord in order to get to rent payment. So the items we have to get from a tenant is information about income to make sure they are at or below 50% AMI. We have to get a documentation that they've been impacted by COVID and they have housing instability. For most of our community members that are in rent arrears, it's pretty obvious that you are having housing instability. And for many community members, it's due to losing job and job reduction as a result of COVID. The other part, so once we get that information from the tenant, there's information we have to get from the landlord, a lease, evidence of being in rent arrears, W-9 form, and information around where to sign the rent check. We have 60 community-based partners that we work with. Some of them focus on the tenants, some of them focus on the landlords, and then a lot of them actually focus on both, making sure we have all the required paperwork from both parties in order to process rent payment. If you don't mind going to the next slide. What we're seeing is the landlord program payments are a little below the average. Right now, the average household payment is around $11,500. When we initially planned for EPRAP, we projected $8,000 a household, with it currently being $11,500, as we are very closely watching how many people are applying for this assistance. It means we will serve less people. That we are glad to see for the landlord programs that the actual amount per unit is lower than expected, which means ultimately we will serve more households. On the other side of that, the tenant pool, so households that come in, self-apply directly to tenant pool, those are higher than expected. Those are around $12,000 per household. To give you a sense of scale, 70% of the people we have served so far are part of the large landlord program. 24% are part of the tenant program. And then around 6% are really coming into our doors directly through these by and for community-based organizations. If you don't mind going to the next slide. So to give you a sense of scale, which I've alluded to a number of times here, we have just around 40,000 people that have expressed an interest in the EPRAP program. Currently, and I'll update these numbers. This is, I think, about a week and a half old. There are 28,000 people that are in process to get to rent payment, and over 8,000 people have actually had their rent paid. If you include the advances we gave to landlords, that's another around 8,000 who we have been able to assure that they will stay in their house while we get to working with that landlord. So that's around 16,000 people we have served so far this year. If you don't mind going to the next slide. This gives you just a sense. This program was very intentionally designed to serve community members disproportionately impacted by COVID, disproportionately impacted by housing instability, and really where in our community we see people that are 50% AMI. So the darker the color blue, the more applicants we have had for the program, and this is applicant data that you're currently looking at. When we look city by city, region by region, similarly, we see the exact same chart with regards to where our payments are. Specifically to Burien, we've had just around 1,500 people express need so far. 50% of those are in the process of being served, and right around 15% have gotten to rent payment so far this year. If you don't mind moving to the next slide. Keep going. Very quickly, another part of the strategy that I mentioned at the beginning is really the eviction prevention strategy. This is work we are doing with all the courts, the eviction courts across King County. We have contracted with the Housing Justice Project so that any community member who does end up in the eviction process, now that both the state moratorium, bridge moratorium is ended, and with the city of Burien specifically, the moratorium that's getting ready to end, community members that are eligible for EPRAP can call the Housing Justice Project. Their number is 206-267-7069. They have legal supports on hand. They will work with eligible tenants to help them avoid an episode of eviction. They have rental assistance funding right there, so they are able to pay the landlord and even the tenant at that point to avoid the eviction moratorium, or avoid eviction now that some of the moratoriums have lifted. So that's an important strategy. The entire time we have been operating EPRAP, the moratoriums have been in place. So now that they are beginning to lift, we're really going to test this part of the EPRAP program. And thank you so much for the opportunity, Colleen. I will stop there and take questions or get some, if you'd like me to clarify anything further, I'm happy to.
Thank you very much. Council, is there any questions, concerns? Go ahead, Councilman Tasta.
Etta, thank you very much for going over all of that. It's obviously a tremendous undertaking and incredibly necessary, so I appreciate it. I'm curious, given, we have had a moratorium, and so we haven't had to, we're not facing as big a problem as we may be facing. Do you have any sense of, you gave some statistics, both region or countywide and in Burien, for how many people you're serving, and you talked about the randomized pool. What percentage of folks that are in need are being served? I mean, are we serving 50% of the people in need? Are we,
Sure.
What's your sense?
Thank you, Council Member, for the question. So of everybody that has expressed a need, either their landlord has applied on their behalf or they have sort of self-served through the tenant pool, currently 76% of all households are in process. So that means we are actively serving them, or they have already gotten to rent payments.
All right. Well, that's better than what I thought I heard you say, of maybe 50% or less. So
Yeah.
Thank you for that. And landlords, there was somewhere in the information that you provided that said something about, whether lives in Seattle or unincorporated King County. I wasn't sure. The program is countywide and it's in all cities. I mean, it's not unique just to unincorporated areas or downtown Seattle. I think you've clarified that. So,
yeah. The program is countywide. Council member, thank you for the question. We have partnered with a number of cities, including Burien. For many jurisdictions, what's happened is for the King County's program, we are focused on 50% AMI or below. Many of the jurisdictions then have focused on that 50 to 80% AMI. For some cities, just because there is a huge need, it is taking us a moment to serve tens of thousands of people. Some cities have reached into the 50% AMI to go ahead and serve community members that would be eligible but are needing to expedite the process further. So that's what we're seeing for the specifically for the city of Seattle. They are such a large jurisdiction. The county's EPRAP system, instead of having two different portals for people to come into, given the scale, people from the city of Seattle come into the county's portal, and then what we do is actually pull names from them specifically for the city of Seattle. And that's really just due to the scale and the fact that the city also got a direct grant from the Department of Treasury. So we've tried as much as possible to streamline our communication here, not have many places that people needed to apply and align where we could. With regards to the eviction piece and the moratorium not lifted yet in Burien, but has been lifted in many other places across the county. As we watch this closely, we are trending exactly the way we are seeing it do it nationally in other big jurisdictions, is that really landlords to date are being patient. They want rent payment. They are not pushing their tenants to the Housing Justice Project or to the eviction court. So we haven't seen a huge amount of increased spending in that strategy. We definitely have seen a lot of people calling, trying to get clarity. The county has put out some communications trying to direct people to the right place and to the right source of information. But we haven't necessarily seen a huge increase in the need to pay rent at the eviction courts, which I'm glad to see is the case at the moment.
Yep, great. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions, Council? Okay, go ahead.
So I'll just jump in here again and say on behalf of Hedda and myself, we thank you for the opportunity to share about both the city's efforts and King County's efforts. We will continue to prioritize the needs of our residents and how we'll do that as we watch the Build Back Better initiative coming forward and what might play out from that, as well as taking a look at how ARPA funds might continue to address the gaps